So let's try and finish up with this chapter here. So we've been speaking about Australopithecus garhi. It emerged in Ethiopia, or was found in Ethiopia, dates to about 2.5 million years ago. It lived in a woodland environment, we've been able to tell. It had large teeth, premolars and molars especially, which are typical of Australopithecines. So it was, in particular, it was pretty typical for Australopithecines in that sense. It wasn't hyper robust or robust, so they didn't have particularly strong jaws or the sagittal crest. So they were eating similar foods to other Australopithecines, but they weren't investing in the tools that made them hyper competitive for that. Now, how could they survive in a competitive world then? Well, it appears that they were starting to use what brains that they had to access different sorts of food that were really, really, really nutritious. Gorillas, chimpanzees, primarily bonobos as well, are primarily, well, gorillas are exclusively, but chimps and bonobos are primarily vegetarians. Chimps and bonobos only get a small portion of their protein by accessing meat eating. Having versatile teeth and a versatile gracile structure allows you to be a little bit less specialized. Like, let me put it this way. A bear is really good at surviving because they can eat anything. They're omnivorous. But wait a moment, what about pandas? They only eat bamboo, right? And nobody else wants bamboo. It's terrible food. So pandas do really well if there's a lot of bamboo around, right? The reason why pandas are going extinct is not because pandas aren't good at eating bamboo, it's because the habitat is being destroyed. So there's less bamboo for them to eat. And so eventually, if we get rid of all the wild bamboo forests, you're no longer going to have pandas that exist in the wild because they are hyper specialized for a particular type of food, right? You can't just say, pandas, look, there's no more bamboo. You got to diversify. You've got to have some different type of diet. Bears, on the other hand, they're like, sure, I'll go eat something else. If it's not available, I'll eat something else. If there's no deer, I'll eat berries or grass. So having a hyper robust strategy for survival is great when those hard-shelled seeds and nuts and grasses exist. But meat is a really nutritious source of energy. Seeds and grasses don't have a lot of nutrition in them. You've got to not only eat a lot of it, but you've also got to sort of process it. Your body has to get all the nutrition it can out of it. That's why a cow has 4 stomachs. Not because a cow wants to have 4 stomachs, but it's hard to get nutrition out of grass and hay. And so they process it, regurgitate it, and chew their cud, and then process it again, and it goes through multiple stomachs, and then that's how they survive. So a robust Australopithecine is starting to specialize in those physical ability to process difficult to extract foods, right? The gracile Australopithecines weren't specializing in that. They were getting something else. And for a long time, we defined our genus, Homo genus. We're Homo sapiens and the other Homo species that existed as being the only tool makers in the world. We thought, in fact, the earliest that we're going to see in just a moment here was, Homo habilis, which literally means handyman. Homo is man, habilis means handy, or handy. So handyman, right? Tool making man, as the name, as the genus and species suggests. We now know that, first of all, primates aren't even the only animals that use tools. Pigs, otters, birds, beavers, all use tools, right? So, and also other primates. We've seen that chimpanzees in the wild can actually make little pointy sticks and can stab creatures to skewer them and then eat them. So when they do eat meat, they often use tools to catch them. Some chimpanzees have been taught to use stones to bash things with. And as it turns out, our ancestors' use of tools didn't start with our genus as we once thought, Homo. It actually goes back to the gracile Australopithecines as well. And that's a strong suggestion that our ancestors can trace their origins back at least to the gracile Australopithecines. Not just because they use tools, but they use the same tools as we see Homo habilis, our genus, using some years later. This is a technology that we call Oldowan. It's named after where they were first found in the Olduvai Gorge. And so this was a huge surprise to people when they found tools associated with a 2.6 million year old site that is associated with Australopithecus garhi rather than Homo habilis. So this surprised us and pushed back the timeline of tool usage. Now, we don't have any direct evidence for hunting or anything like that. But what we do see is that there are, dating to some of these first tool use, we have cut marks on bones. Now, that shows that, however, these creatures were getting a hold of carcasses of animals that they could then process. Let's say, take a zebra or something that was killed by a pride of lions or wild dogs on the savannas. You can imagine how a group of hyenas might come to this carcass. They have extremely powerful jaws that will crush bones and get to the marrow, and they have sharp teeth that can rip the meat right off the bones. That's how hyenas get their meals. But one of our ancestors, have you ever tried to pull like raw chicken off of a bone? It's not coming off. It is not coming off. And I do not recommend you trying to bite into raw chicken with your teeth either. We would get sick doing that. So how does an Australopithecus get, even if they wanted to be omnivorous and say, there's some good nutrition in that meat there, better than these grasses and seeds I've been eating, if I could just get that, that would really help my survival. But how do you get it? Well, they seem to have figured out that maybe just by trial and error or experience, that stones can be sharp, right? If a broken stone, you can cut your foot on. And maybe if it cuts your foot, you might just have enough brain power as an Australopithecus to put two and two together and say, that's a sharp stone that couldn't cut my foot. Here's another bit of flesh. Maybe I can use that to cut. And we actually have evidence for this with cut marks on the bones made using some of the tools that we've found in this extremely simple tool technology. It's very simple. You and I could both make very easily Oldowan stone tools. All it is taking off little flakes from a particular end and creating a sharp edge on that. Then you can use that to slice or to chop or to crush. So this seems to have supplemented the diet and made them more competitive, not by developing strong jaws like a hyena or sharp teeth like a lion, but brains that get strong and sharp tools through artificial means by picking that up. And then you can get rid of it and you don't have to carry it around. You don't need any nutritional investment in a stone tool. All you need to have is a brain that can figure out how to manipulate the world to suit you. So the robust Australopithecines are developing, especially the hyper robust, are becoming more and more specialized. Australopithecus Ethiopicus, Australopithecus boise, they have different physiology that's starting to develop, and you can see some pictures on the slides of that sagittal crest that Garhi never developed because the gracile forms were not developing strong, powerful jaws and muscles. They were developing strong, powerful brains. Paranthropus as well is also referred to as is another name for a form of robust Australopithecus. They had massive molars and large chewing muscles, and they had a diet of seeds and fruits, and they were becoming very specialized. So Paranthropus is another form of what we would call boise, right? So a hyper robust form. So you have these two branches. You have the gracile Australopithecines like Garhi, who is now starting to develop tools, and you have the robust forms that are investing in their physiology that makes them specialists in processing not very nutritious food, but that's plentiful and abundant, so they can always get it, but they've got to have the tools to be able to do that, and the digestion to be able to do that. Contemporary with Paranthropus or Australopithecus boise, so this hyper robust form that's hyper specialized in that type of diet, you then start to see emerging the first Homo species. Homo habilis is the earliest that we know of, but it was contemporary with Paranthropus probably about 2 million years ago, maybe a little bit earlier than that with Homo habilis. And this is where you start to see the outcome of what tool usage was doing in Australopithecus garhi. That once you start to choose that path of saying, we need a good brain to figure out stuff so we don't have to develop a hyper-specialized physiology, then the brain starts getting rewarded for thinking through problems. That once you start to make tools, then the better your tools or the better you can access those tools, the better your diet becomes, the more competitive you are, and then your next generation is going to be selecting for bigger and bigger brains. We start to see that happening. So rather than the robust becoming hyper robust, super specialized, our specialization, our ancestors' specialization starts to move towards bigger brains. And you see that first with Homo habilis, which has a much larger brain than their ancestors, which were about 350 cubic centimeters. You start to see Homo habilis having about 500 to 800 cubic centimeters brains. And these fossils of Homo habilis first date to the latter half of the 2 million mark, so 2.5 to 1.6 million years ago. Now, we're going to round this out with another Homo species, but this is going to be a longer discussion that we're going to carry on over into the next chapter a little bit. Homo erectus, meaning upright walking man, is the second oldest member of the genus Homo, and there are fossils that date to about 9 to 1.5 million years ago. A pretty easily accepted date is about 1.8 million years ago for Homo erectus. And they come from Africa. The earliest evidence comes from Africa. It's very clear that Homo erectus is developing alongside some of these other Australopithecines and Homo habilis. But things start to change. Homo habilis was small, almost Australopithecine-like, but a slightly larger brain and a lot of tool usage. So where you only find rare examples with the Australopithecines of tool usage, it's typical. You find sites all over the place with Homo habilis using tons of tools. That's why we gave it the name handyman, is because it was associated primarily with this Oldowan tool technology. Now, Oldowan, that's not a much better technology than what chimps use, right? It's not particularly sophisticated. It's just smashing a rock, making a sharp edge, and using it to cut or smash. Homo erectus seems to have taken this trend of using their omnivorous ability a little bit further. And Homo erectus is extremely important. Homo habilis is sort of the outgrowth of what we saw with the gracile Australopithecines, but Homo erectus is much more similar to humans. They are, if you were to look at the postcranial, that is the body of a Homo erectus, you would have a hard time distinguishing it from a human. They're same body shape and size. They are sometimes even taller than we are, probably about 6 feet tall, something like that. And in Africa, it's often Homo erectus is referred to as Homo ergaster, but and this is the early forms, especially that continue on in Africa. But as we're going to see, Homo erectus does a little bit more than just adapt to local conditions. Homo erectus were the first to spread out of Africa. Now, let me go back a little bit to tool usage. Now, were the Australopithecines hunting? As I think I mentioned, there's no evidence for that. And in fact, there's strong evidence that they weren't, that they were opportunists. Because when you find those cut marks on the bones that I mentioned, you often find them overlying chew marks from predators and scavengers. Now that means that the scavengers got there first, or the predators got there first, they put their teeth into them, they started eating, and then Australopithecus garhi and later Homo habilis came across this carcass and were like, there's still some meat on these bones, but how do I get it off? Let's take and butcher this carcass and eat the meat. So it looks like they were scavenging rather than hunting. This seems to change with Homo erectus. If you want meat, you got to go get it. So it must have been a supplementary part of Australopithecus garhi and Homo habilis' diet. They must have still been primarily vegetarians, but occasionally when they would come across meat, they were able to access it and make the most of it. That then started to develop larger brains because they had better nutrition. And then once you had better nutrition, you had to feed that brain that was really expensive. And so Homo erectus, which then suddenly almost doubles in size in terms of brain size, up to like 1,000 cc's. To give you an impression, humans are about 1,600, 1,650 cc's, something like that. Maybe even as low as 1,400 cc's for some smaller individuals, which doesn't make them any less intelligent, but just smaller. So there's a range, but you get consistently Homo erectus at 1,000 cc's. Later forms of Homo erectus even overlapping into our range as well. So Homo erectus was really prioritizing the brain as their main adaptation. They also had a longer stride. Their body type, like ours, longer legs, that seems to have been a benefit for the next stage that we're talking about. They started to, rather than opportunistically find meat, they went after it. and they almost certainly hunted, which means that they had to do so cooperatively, which means that they're probably developing some kind of communication system. Maybe not, there's no evidence for them being able to speak yet, but they must have been able to cooperate in terms of hunting. The hominin sites like Olduvai Gorge show this sequence, and there's some evidence here that show the different ages, especially the massic bed formation in Olduvai Gorge, which show where the fossils and the tools show up in this sequence. So this evidence that I'm talking to you through right now and trying to simplify, it's all there, and there's evidence for that in your book, right? So this Oldowan tool technology develops and throughout this time. But when we get to Homo erectus, these Oldowan tools are not particularly good at hunting. They're just rocks, right? They're just rocks with some sharp edges on them. They're good for processing carcasses, but you wouldn't want to hunt with something like that. And this is where that big brain comes in handy with, in fact, maybe the whole purpose of that big brain is that whereas Australopithecus garhi and Homo habilis were able to make very simple tool technology that was ready at any given time, that if you found a carcass, you just looked around and you said, okay, here's a stone, I can smash it, I can cut that, I chuck the stone, it's gone, I don't need it, I don't need to think about it. I'll get another stone later if I need to. But we have a new technology emerging with Homo erectus, and it's called the Acheulean. And I can't really stress how important the Acheulean technology change is, because what it is rather than Homo habilis, for instance, replicating a sharp rock that they've seen elsewhere and maybe cut their foot on, the Acheulean technology is what we call a biface. And it is completely carved out, chipped off in the round. So none of the original stone surface exists. They've whittled it down to a sort of a teardrop shape, probably about this size, that has no original surfaces on it at all. Now, why is that important? Because this tells us that Homo erectus at one point closed their eyes and imagined what a tool might look like. And then they said, I'm going to make that. I'm going to make that mental picture that I've got in my brain. They weren't replicating something that they had seen before. An Acheulean tool, a biface like that, has never existed in the world before. They made it whole cloth out of their brains. And it was a